When billionaire CEO Richard Blackstone walked into his company that Monday morning, he never imagined he'd fire someone who would completely change his understanding of success, power, and what it truly means to be wealthy. The man he dismissed seemed ordinary, but what happened next defied everything Richard thought he knew about business and life itself. The glass elevator climbed silently toward the 52nd floor of the Blackstone Tower, carrying its owner through the heart of his empire. Richard Blackstone stood motionless, his 6'2" frame impeccably dressed in a charcoal Armani suit that cost more than most people earned in 6 months. At 55 he commanded respect through presence alone, steel-gray eyes that missed nothing, silver hair perfectly styled, and the kind of confidence that came from 30 years of crushing competition and building fortunes. Through the elevator's transparent walls, he could see the sprawling cityscape of Manhattan. Every building, every street corner, every flashing billboard represented opportunity, profit, or conquest to him. This was his kingdom, and from the pinnacle of his tower, he ruled an empire worth $12 billion. The elevator chimed softly as it reached the executive floor. Richard stepped out into the marble-lined corridor where his personal assistant Margaret waited with military precision. She had worked for him for 15 years, long enough to read his moods and anticipate his needs before he voiced them. "Good morning, Mr. Blackstone," Margaret said, falling into step beside him as he strode toward his corner office. "Your 9 a.m. meeting with the Singapore investors has been moved to 10:30. The quarterly reports from all divisions are on your desk, and there's been a situation in human resources that requires your immediate attention." Richard paused at his office door, one hand on the brushed steel handle. "What kind of situation?" Margaret consulted her tablet, her expression carefully neutral. "It appears we have a new employee in the custodial department who's been causing some disruption." Disruption? Richard's voice carried the edge that made board members nervous. "What kind of disruption? Theft, harassment, industrial espionage?" "None of those, sir. According to the reports, he's been helping other employees with personal problems during work hours. Yesterday he spent his lunch break talking to Sandra from accounting about her mother's cancer diagnosis. The day before he helped Martinez from security fill out college application forms for his daughter. This morning he was found in the break room consoling 3 employees who were upset about the recent layoffs." Richard's expression darkened. He pushed open his office door and entered the sanctuary of power that was his domain. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of Central Park. His desk, carved from a single piece of mahogany, dominated the space like an altar of capitalism. Awards, photographs with presidents and world leaders, and symbols of his success lined the walls. "How long has this person been employed here?" Richard asked, settling into his leather chair. "He was hired 3 days ago through a temporary agency. His name is, well, that's part of the problem. His employment paperwork lists him simply as J. Christ. No first name, no middle initial, just J. Christ. HR tried to contact the agency for clarification, but they claimed to have no record of sending anyone by that name." Richard leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. In 30 years of business, he had learned that anomalies were either opportunities or threats, and he had no patience for either when they disrupted his carefully orchestrated machine. "Where is he now?" "On the 30th floor cleaning offices in the accounting department." "Bring him up here, now." Margaret hesitated. "Sir, perhaps it would be better to handle this through proper HR channels." Richard's stare could freeze water. "Margaret, in the 15 years you've worked for me, have I ever repeated an instruction?" "No, sir. I'll have security escort him up immediately." While Margaret made the arrangements, Richard turned to face the window. The city sprawled beneath him like a game board where he moved pieces worth millions with a single phone call. He had built this empire from nothing, starting with a small construction company inherited from his father and transforming it into a multinational corporation with interests in real estate, technology, manufacturing, and finance. The journey had required sacrifices. There was no room for sentimentality in business, no place for the weak or the unfocused. Every decision had to serve the bottom line. Every employee had to contribute measurably to profit. He had learned early that kindness was a luxury that cost more than most companies could afford. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Margaret's voice came through the intercom. "Mr. Blackstone, security is here with the individual. Send him in." Richard turned from the window, prepared to see another example of the kind of employee who didn't understand the reality of corporate life. Perhaps it would be someone who thought a paycheck entitled them to treat the workplace as a therapy center, or maybe another bleeding heart who believed businesses existed to solve personal problems rather than generate profit. The door opened and security guard Thompson stepped inside, followed by a man who immediately commanded Richard's attention in a way that surprised him. The man appeared to be in his mid-30s, of average height with a lean build that suggested physical labor. His custodial uniform was simple but impeccably clean. He had shoulder-length dark hair that looked as though it had been carefully maintained despite his obvious lack of means for expensive grooming. His beard was full but neatly trimmed, framing a face that was both strong and gentle. But it was his eyes that stopped Richard mid-thought. They were dark brown, almost black, and held a depth that seemed to contain centuries of wisdom and compassion. When those eyes met his, Richard felt an unexpected sensation, as though this stranger could see not just his face, but straight through to his soul. "Mr. Blackstone," Thompson said, "this is the employee from the custodial department." Richard nodded curtly. "That will be all, Thompson. Close the door behind you." Once they were alone, Richard studied the man standing calmly before his desk. Most employees summoned to his office showed signs of nervousness, fidgeting, avoiding eye contact, speaking too quickly or not at all. This man stood with quiet dignity, his hands relaxed at his sides, meeting Richard's gaze without defiance or submission. "Sit down," Richard commanded, gesturing to one of the leather chairs facing his desk. The man moved with an easy grace and settled into the chair, waiting patiently for Richard to speak. There was something unsettling about his composure, as though he were completely comfortable in any situation. "I understand there's some confusion about your employment records," Richard began. "My HR department can't seem to verify your identity or how you came to work here." "Identity can be complicated," the man replied, his voice carrying a slight accent that Richard couldn't place. "Sometimes we're known by our actions rather than our paperwork." Richard leaned forward, his businessman's instincts detecting evasion. "That's an interesting philosophy, but it doesn't answer my question. Who are you, and how did you get hired?" "I'm someone who needed work, and your company needed someone to do it. The details of how that arrangement came about seem less important than whether the work is being done well." "The work itself isn't the issue," Richard said, his voice growing sharper. "The issue is that you're apparently using company time to provide unauthorized counseling services to my employees. This is a business, not a social service agency." For the first time the man's expression showed emotion, a flicker of sadness that passed across his features like a shadow. "I see people in pain, and I try to help them." "Is that wrong?" "It's inefficient," Richard snapped. "You're paid to clean offices, not to solve people's personal problems. Every minute you spend playing therapist is a minute stolen from the work you're actually employed to do. And if helping someone through a difficult moment allows them to work more effectively, isn't that beneficial to your company?" Richard had to admit the logic was sound, but he dismissed it immediately. "That's not your concern. Employee welfare is handled by our Human Resources Department and our Employee Assistance Programs. We have procedures, protocols, and trained professionals for these matters." "Yes," the man said quietly, "I've observed your procedures." Sandra from accounting was told she could take unpaid leave to care for her dying mother, but that her position couldn't be guaranteed when she returned. Martinez was informed that the company doesn't provide educational assistance for family members. The three employees, upset about the layoffs, were given pamphlets about managing stress and told to contact a counseling service that charges $200 per session. Each word hit Richard like an accusation, though the man's tone remained gentle and non-judgmental. Richard felt his anger rising, not just at the implied criticism, but at the uncomfortable recognition that this stranger had identified every inadequacy in his company's employee relations. "Those policies exist for good reasons," Richard said, his voice cold. "We can't run a profitable business by becoming financially responsible for every personal crisis in our employees' lives. Tough decisions are necessary for survival in a competitive market." "I understand the logic," the man replied, "but I wonder if you've considered the cost of those tough decisions." "The cost is irrelevant if the alternative is bankruptcy." "I didn't build this company by being charitable." "No," the man agreed, "you built it by being brilliant, hard-working and determined. But somewhere along the way, you stopped building and started defending." The observation struck Richard like a physical blow. For a moment he was speechless, not because the words were wrong, but because they were so precisely right. When had he stopped dreaming about what his company could become, and started focusing only on protecting what it already was? "Who are you to analyze my business philosophy?" Richard demanded, recovering his composure. "You're a janitor with fake credentials and a savior complex. I'm someone who sees potential where others see problems. Your employees aren't just resources to be managed, Richard. They're human beings with hopes, fears, dreams, and struggles. When you treat them as nothing more than interchangeable parts in a machine, you waste the greatest asset any business can have. And what asset is that? Love." Richard almost laughed. "Love? You think love belongs in a boardroom? You think love pays dividends or increases market share? This is exactly the kind of naive thinking that destroys companies." "Love isn't naive, Richard. Love is the most practical force in the universe. It builds loyalty that no salary can buy. It inspires performance that no threat can motivate. It creates innovation that no policy can mandate." "You're talking about fairy tales," Richard said, but even as he spoke, he felt an unexpected stirring of something he had buried long ago. "This is a corporation, not a family reunion. Why can't it be both?" The question hung in the air between them. Richard found himself remembering the early days of his company, when he knew every employee by name, when he had personally visited workers in the hospital, when the Christmas party felt like a celebration rather than a corporate obligation. When had efficiency become more important than humanity? "Because sentiment is a luxury I can't afford," Richard said finally. "I have shareholders to answer to, competitors to outmaneuver, and profits to maintain. Every dollar I spend on employee comfort is a dollar not invested in growth. And every employee you lose to burnout, stress, or better opportunities elsewhere costs you how much in recruitment, training, and lost productivity?" Richard had heard these arguments before from consultants and business school professors, but coming from this mysterious custodian, they carried a weight he couldn't dismiss. Still, he had spent 30 years building walls around his emotions, and he wasn't about to let a stranger tear them down. "This conversation is over," Richard announced, standing behind his desk. "Your employment is terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you out." The man remained seated, looking up at Richard with those unsettling eyes. "Is that really what you want to do?" "It's what I have to do. You don't fit into this organization." "I see." The man stood slowly, his movements graceful and unhurried. "May I ask you one question before I go?" Richard wanted to refuse, wanted to call security and have this disruptive presence removed immediately. But something about the man's dignity, his complete lack of anger or resentment, made Richard nod curtly. 23 years ago, you made a decision that changed the course of your life. A decision that transformed you from someone who cared deeply about people into someone who trusts only numbers and systems. Do you remember what that decision was? Richard felt the blood drain from his face. 23 years ago, the memory hit him like a tsunami, bringing back emotions he had spent more than 2 decades burying. David Martinez, the young accountant with the pregnant wife and the sick father. The employee who had made a mistake, a significant but not catastrophic error that cost the company $3 million. Richard had a choice that day. He could work with David to understand what went wrong, help him learn from the mistake, and find ways to prevent similar errors in the future. Or he could make an example of him, showing the entire company that mistakes had consequences and that efficiency mattered more than individual circumstances. He chose efficiency. He fired David publicly, in front of the entire accounting department, making sure everyone understood that their jobs depended on perfection. 2 months later, Richard learned that David's wife had miscarried due to stress, and his father had died without the medical care David could no longer afford. "How do you know about David Martinez?" Richard whispered. "The same way I know that you visit his grave every year on the anniversary of his father's death," the man replied gently. "The same way I know that you've donated anonymously to his children's education. The same way I know that you lie awake at 3 a.m. wondering if building an empire was worth losing your soul." Richard sank back into his chair, his hands trembling. No one knew about the grave visits, no one knew about the anonymous donations. He had never told anyone, not even his wife, about the guilt that had driven him to build higher walls around his heart. "Who are you?" he asked again. But this time the question carried desperation rather than anger. I'm someone who believes you can still become the man you were meant to be, the man said. The man who started this company because he wanted to create something meaningful, not just profitable. That man died with David Martinez. No, Richard, that man has been hiding, waiting for permission to live again. Richard looked up into those impossibly deep eyes, and saw something that terrified and attracted him in equal measure. He saw acceptance without judgment, love without conditions, and hope without naivety. What do you want from me? Richard asked. I want you to remember who you are underneath all the armor you've built. I want you to rediscover the joy of building rather than just protecting. I want you to find out what happens when you lead with love instead of fear. And if I refuse, then you continue living as you have been, successful but empty, powerful but alone. Richard stood again, but this time his movement lacked the confident authority he usually projected. I've made my decision. You need to leave. The man nodded sadly. I understand. But before I go, I want you to know something. The decision you make today will determine not just your future, but the future of everyone who works for you. You have the power to create an organization that transforms lives, builds dreams, and changes the world. Or you can continue managing a machine that generates profit while crushing spirits. He turned toward the door, then paused. David Martinez forgave you long ago, Richard. The only person who hasn't forgiven you is yourself. Richard watched the man walk toward the door, each step echoing in the sudden silence of the office. Part of him wanted to call out, to ask the stranger to stay, to explain how he could possibly know such intimate details about Richard's life. But the larger part, the part that had been hardened by decades of corporate warfare, remained silent. The door closed with a soft click, leaving Richard alone with his thoughts and the lingering sense that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He moved to the window and looked down at the street 52 floors below, wondering if he would see the mysterious custodian emerge from the building. But the sidewalks were filled with anonymous figures hurrying to their own important appointments, and he couldn't distinguish one from another. Richard returned to his desk and tried to focus on the quarterly reports, but the numbers seemed meaningless. For the first time in years, he found himself thinking not about profit margins and market share, but about the faces of his employees. Sandra, struggling to balance work and caring for her dying mother. Martinez, working 2 jobs to support his family while trying to help his daughter get an education. The 3 employees mourning their laid-off colleagues, wondering if they would be next. When had he stopped seeing them as people, and started seeing them only as assets or liabilities? The intercom buzzed. Mr. Blackstone, your 10:30 meeting with the Singapore investors is ready to begin. Cancel it, Richard said without thinking. Sir, cancel all my meetings for today. I need some time to think. There was a pause. In 15 years Margaret had never heard him cancel meetings without rescheduling immediately. Of course, sir. Should I provide any explanation to the clients? Tell them I'm conducting a strategic review of company priorities. As Margaret handled the cancellations, Richard sat in his chair, staring at the door through which the mysterious man had departed. The encounter had lasted less than 30 minutes, but it had shaken foundations he thought were unshakable. He thought about David Martinez, and for the first time in 23 years, he allowed himself to remember not just the mistake David had made, but the man he had been. David was the employee who stayed late to help colleagues with difficult projects, the one who organized birthday celebrations and retirement parties, the one who had tears in his eyes when he talked about his pregnant wife and his father's cancer diagnosis. Richard had destroyed that man to send a message about efficiency and accountability. In doing so, he had sent a different message entirely: that people were expendable, that compassion was weakness, and that the only value that mattered was measurable profit. The phone rang, jarring him from his thoughts. The caller ID showed his wife's number. "Hello, Elizabeth," he answered. "Richard, I'm surprised you picked up. Margaret said you canceled all your meetings today. Are you feeling all right?" Elizabeth had been married to him for 28 years, long enough to know that canceling meetings was as unusual as Richard declaring bankruptcy. "I'm fine," he said automatically, then stopped. "Actually no, I'm not fine. I think I made a terrible mistake today." What kind of mistake? Richard found himself telling her about the encounter with the mysterious custodian, about the questions that had shaken him, about the memories of David Martinez that he had never shared with anyone. Elizabeth listened in silence until he finished. Then she said quietly, "Richard, do you remember why you started the company? To make money, to build something lasting?" "No," she said gently. You started it because you wanted to prove that businesses could be successful while still treating people with dignity. You wanted to show that you could be profitable and humane at the same time. Richard closed his eyes, remembering conversations from 30 years ago when he had been young and idealistic, full of plans to revolutionize corporate culture. That was before I learned how the real world works, he said. Or maybe that was before you decided the real world had to work that way. After ending the call with his wife, Richard sat alone in his office as afternoon faded into evening. The cleaning crew would normally be working their way through the building by now, but Richard found himself wondering who was doing the work that the mysterious man would have been assigned. He made a decision that surprised him. Instead of leaving through his private elevator, he took the regular elevator down to the 30th floor where the man had been working that morning. The accounting department was quiet, most employees having gone home for the day. But Richard could see Sandra still at her desk, talking quietly on the phone. As he approached, he realized she was crying. "Mom, I know you're scared," Sandra was saying. "I'm scared too. But the doctor said the treatment could help. We just have to take it one day at a time." Richard stood frozen outside Sandra's cubicle, listening to a conversation that revealed the inadequacy of his company's response to her crisis. She was trying to comfort her dying mother while managing her own grief and fear, and his organization had offered her nothing but unpaid leave and uncertainty. Sandra noticed him standing there, and quickly ended the call, wiping her eyes and trying to compose herself. "Mr. Blackstone, I didn't know you were still in the building. I was just finishing up some reports." "Sandra," Richard said, then stopped. He had no practice with this kind of conversation, no experience offering comfort or support. "Sir, how is your mother?" The question surprised both of them. Sandra looked at him uncertainly, as though trying to determine whether this was a trap. She's not doing well, sir. The cancer has spread, and the treatments are very aggressive. She's frightened and she doesn't like being alone. And you've been told you can take unpaid leave." "Yes, sir, but I can't afford to be without income for an extended period. My mother's medical bills are already more than I can handle." Richard nodded, understanding for the first time the impossible position his policies had created. Sandra was being asked to choose between caring for her dying mother and keeping her job. "What if that wasn't your only option?" Richard asked. Sandra looked confused. "I'm sorry, sir. What if you could work from home, or work flexible hours that allowed you to spend time with your mother without sacrificing your income?" Hope flickered in Sandra's eyes, followed quickly by suspicion. "I don't understand. Is this some kind of test?" Richard realized that his reputation for ruthlessness had made even simple kindness seem like a trick. How had he become the kind of leader his employees feared rather than trusted? "It's not a test, Sandra. It's a strategic adjustment to our policies. I want you to work with HR tomorrow to develop a plan that allows you to care for your mother while maintaining your position and your salary." Tears began flowing down Sandra's cheeks. "Mr. Blackstone, I don't know what to say. Thank you. Thank you so much." As Richard walked back to his office, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a warmth that had nothing to do with profit margins or competitive advantages. He had made one person's impossible situation slightly more manageable, and the feeling was more satisfying than closing his most lucrative deal. But it also raised uncomfortable questions. If he could make an exception for Sandra, why hadn't he been making exceptions all along? How many other employees were struggling with problems that could be solved with flexibility and compassion rather than rigid policies? Back in his office, Richard called Margaret at home. "Sir, is everything all right?" "Margaret, I want you to schedule meetings with every department head tomorrow. I want detailed reports on employee issues that current policies can't address effectively. And I want recommendations for how we can do better." "Better in what way, sir?" "Better at treating our employees like human beings rather than interchangeable parts." There was a long pause. "Sir, are you feeling well? Should I call Dr. Morrison?" Richard almost smiled. "I'm feeling clearer than I have in years, Margaret. Just schedule the meetings." After ending the call, Richard remained in his office well into the evening, thinking about the mysterious man who had appeared in his life for less than an hour, but had somehow managed to crack the foundation of everything he thought he believed about business and success. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, and new opportunities to choose between the man he had become and the man he had once intended to be.
But tonight, for the first time in 23 years, Richard Blackstone fell asleep at his desk with a smile on his face, dreaming not of quarterly earnings or market dominance, but of David Martinez nodding approval from somewhere beyond the grave.
The next morning Richard Blackstone arrived at his office 2 hours earlier than usual. The city was still waking up, and the Blackstone Tower stood like a silent sentinel against the dawn sky. For the first time in decades, Richard hadn't needed an alarm clock. He had awakened naturally, feeling more energized than he had in years. Margaret arrived to find him already at his desk, surrounded by employee files and policy manuals that he had never bothered to read in detail. "Good morning, Mr. Blackstone," she said, unable to hide her surprise. "You're here early. I've been thinking about yesterday's conversation," Richard said without looking up from the files. "I want to understand exactly how we've been treating our people." Margaret set down his usual coffee, black, no sugar, and hesitated. "Sir, I took the liberty of reviewing some of the cases that might interest you. Would you like me to start with Martinez and security?" Richard nodded and Margaret opened her tablet. "Fernando Martinez has been with us for 8 years. He works the night shift Monday through Friday, and picks up weekend shifts whenever they're available. He's never been late, never called in sick, and has received commendations from 3 different department heads for his professionalism. And his daughter, Maria Martinez, 17 years old, honor roll student who wants to study engineering. She's been accepted to 3 universities, but the family can't afford tuition. Fernando has been working a second job at a warehouse, but even with both incomes they're still short about $15,000 per year." Richard did quick mental math. $15,000 was less than he spent on wine in a month. It was a rounding error in his quarterly budget, but it represented the difference between a brilliant young woman achieving her dreams or settling for something far less. "What would it cost us to provide educational assistance for employees' children?" Richard asked. Margaret looked surprised. "We've never offered anything like that, sir. I'd have to research comparable programs at other companies." "Don't research other companies. I want to know what it would cost us to do it right. Full tuition, books, living expenses for employees' children who maintain academic standards. That could be quite expensive, sir. We have over 3,000 employees. Margaret, yesterday we spent more money on a single advertising campaign than most families see in a lifetime. I want those numbers on my desk by noon." As Margaret left to prepare the research, Richard returned to the employee files. Each folder told a story of a real person struggling with real problems while trying to contribute to his company's success. Single mothers working multiple jobs, older employees dealing with health issues, young people trying to start families while managing student debt. When had he stopped seeing these stories and started seeing only the numbers? His first meeting of the day was with the head of human resources, Patricia Stevens. She entered his office with the nervous energy of someone expecting to be fired. "Mr. Blackstone, I understand you want to review our employee policies. I want to understand why Sandra Williams was told she could only take unpaid leave to care for her dying mother." Patricia consulted her notes. "That's standard policy, sir. We offer unpaid family leave in accordance with federal law, but the company can't afford to pay employees who aren't working." "Can't afford." Richard's voice carried an edge that made Patricia flinch. "Patricia, we posted profits of $800 million last quarter. We can't afford to pay one employee her salary while she cares for her dying mother. Sir, if we make exceptions for one person, then everyone will expect exceptions. We have to maintain consistent policies." "You're right," Richard said, and Patricia looked relieved. "We do need consistent policies. I want you to draft new guidelines that consistently prioritize human dignity alongside corporate efficiency." Patricia looked confused. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean, sir." "I mean that starting today, any employee dealing with a family medical crisis gets paid leave, flexible schedules, and whatever support they need to handle their situation without sacrificing their job security." "Sir, that could be very expensive." Richard stood and walked to his window, looking down at the street where thousands of people hurried to jobs that might or might not treat them with basic human decency. "Patricia, what do you think it costs us when good employees quit because we won't accommodate their human needs? What does it cost us in recruitment, training, and lost productivity when people leave for companies that treat them better?" "I've never calculated those numbers, sir." "Calculate them. And while you're at it, calculate the cost of our current employee turnover rate. I want to know exactly how much money our efficient policies are actually costing us." After Patricia left, Richard had meetings with department heads throughout the morning. Each conversation revealed new examples of how rigid policies and profit-focused thinking had created unnecessary hardship for his employees. The head of IT mentioned a brilliant programmer who had been passed over for promotion 3 times because he refused to work the 80-hour weeks that had become standard in the department. He insists on being home for dinner with his kids, the manager said with obvious disapproval. And that's a problem because, Richard asked, well, sir, dedication to the company should come first. We need people who are willing to sacrifice for success. Richard thought about his own marriage, how many dinners he had missed, how many of his children's milestones he had skipped for meetings that probably could have been handled the next day. What if dedication to the company included creating an environment where people could excel at work and still have a life outside of it? Richard asked. The IT manager looked as though Richard had suggested they start conducting meetings in Swahili. By lunchtime, Richard had heard dozens of similar stories. Employees afraid to take sick days, workers hiding family problems to avoid being seen as uncommitted, people staying in jobs they had outgrown because they couldn't risk losing health insurance during a family member's illness. Margaret returned with the educational assistant's research just as Richard was finishing a sandwich at his desk. Another break from routine, since he usually attended business lunches that lasted 3 hours and accomplished nothing. The numbers, sir, Margaret said, setting a folder on his desk. A comprehensive educational assistance program would cost approximately $12 million annually, assuming 50% participation rate among eligible employees. Richard opened the folder and studied the breakdown. $12 million sounded like a lot until he compared it to other line items in his budget. The company had spent $14 million on executive bonuses the previous year. They had spent $18 million on a corporate retreat that accomplished nothing except reinforcing the gap between management and workers. What about the cost of our current turnover rate? Richard asked. That's more difficult to calculate precisely, but our HR department estimates we spend about $8 million annually on recruitment and training to replace departing employees. That doesn't include the productivity lost during transition periods or the knowledge that walks out the door when experienced people leave. Richard did the math quickly. The educational assistance program would essentially pay for itself if it reduced turnover by just 15%. And that calculation didn't include the immeasurable value of having employees who felt genuinely valued and supported. Implement it, Richard said. Sir, the educational assistance program, implemented immediately. I want the policy in place by the end of the week. Margaret stared at him. Sir, a program of this magnitude usually requires board approval, legal review, budget committee analysis. I own 62% of this company, Margaret. I don't need anyone's approval to treat my employees decently. As Margaret left to begin implementation, Richard found himself thinking again about the mysterious custodian from the day before. The man had somehow seen through decades of Richard's carefully constructed defenses to identify the exact moment when compassion had been replaced by calculation. David Martinez. The name still carried the power to make Richard's chest tighten with regret. But today, instead of pushing the memory away, Richard allowed himself to examine it fully. David had been more than just an employee who made a mistake. He had been a young man trying to build a life, support a family, and care for aging parents while learning a demanding job. The error he made miscalculating depreciation schedules on a major project missed was significant but correctable. Richard could have used it as a teaching moment, an opportunity to improve systems and prevent similar mistakes. Instead, he had made it an execution. The intercom buzzed. Mr. Blackstone, there's someone here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, but he says you'll want to speak with him. Richard's pulse quickened. Who is it? He says his name is Jay Christ, sir. The same man from yesterday. Richard felt his hands begin to tremble slightly. After spending the night and morning implementing changes inspired by their conversation, he had begun to wonder if the encounter had been real, or if stress had finally caused him to hallucinate. Send him in. The door opened, and the same figure from yesterday entered Richard's office. But somehow, in the daylight streaming through the windows, he looked different. The custodial uniform was gone, replaced by simple clothing that seemed to glow with its own light. His presence filled the room with a sense of peace that Richard had never experienced in this space.
"Hello, Richard," the man said, and his voice carried the same gentle authority as before. "You came back," Richard said,
standing behind his desk. "I told you I was someone who sees potential where others see problems. I wanted to see what you would do with a night to think." Richard gestured to the files scattered across his desk, the policy manuals, the implementation plans. "I've been trying to understand how I became someone I never intended to be." The man moved closer to the desk, and Richard caught sight of something that made his breath stop. The stranger's hands, as he reached out to touch one of the employee files, bore unmistakable scars, precise marks that looked like wounds from nails driven through his palms. "Richard," the man said gently, "do you know who I am?" Richard's legs gave out, and he sank into his chair. The scars, the inexplicable knowledge of his deepest secrets, the ability to see into his soul, suddenly everything clicked into place with a clarity that was both terrifying and wonderful. Richard's voice failed him. "I'm someone who has been waiting patiently for you to remember that love is the foundation of everything worthwhile," the man said. "I'm someone who knew you before you built your first wall around your heart." Richard stared at the scarred hands, then looked up into those impossibly deep eyes. "You're Jesus." The man smiled, and the simple expression seemed to illuminate the entire office. "I'm someone who has been trying to get your attention for 23 years. Someone who watched you punish yourself for David Martinez's death by punishing everyone else around you." But how? Why? Richard's questions tumbled over each other. "Because every soul matters to me, Richard." The wealthy CEO struggling with guilt, the dying mother afraid of leaving her daughter, the security guard working 2 jobs to send his daughter to college, the young accountant who made a mistake and paid for it with his life. Richard felt tears beginning to flow down his cheeks. David is at peace, Richard. He forgave you long before he died. The cancer that killed his father, the stress that caused his wife's miscarriage, these weren't punishments for your decision. They were tragedies that happen in a broken world, but your guilt transformed you into someone who spread more brokenness instead of healing. "I don't know how to fix what I've become," Richard whispered. Jesus moved around the desk and placed one of his scarred hands on Richard's shoulder. The touch sent warmth through Richard's entire body, dissolving tensions he had carried for decades. "You've already started fixing it," Jesus said. "Sandra will be able to care for her mother without losing her job. Fernando's daughter will get her education. 50 other families will have opportunities they never dreamed possible because of the decisions you made this morning. But it doesn't undo the damage I've caused, the people I've hurt, the families I've destroyed with my coldness." "No," Jesus agreed. "It doesn't undo the past, but it redeems it. Every act of kindness you show from now on honors the memory of those you hurt. Every employee you treat with dignity validates David Martinez's belief that people are more important than profits." Richard looked up at the man standing beside him, at Jesus. His mind still struggled to accept and felt a peace he had never experienced. "What do I do now?" Richard asked. "You live differently. You build your company into something that reflects the values you originally intended. You show the business world that success and compassion aren't mutually exclusive. And will you stay? Will you help me figure this out?" Jesus smiled again. "I've always been here, Richard. You just couldn't see me through all the walls you had built. Now that the walls are coming down, you'll find me in every act of kindness, every moment of forgiveness, every time you choose love over fear." Richard wiped his eyes and looked around his office, at the awards that had once seemed so important, at the view that had represented his dominance over the city, at the symbols of a success that had cost him his soul. "I want to do more than just change policies," Richard said. "I want to transform what it means to be successful in business." "Then do it," Jesus said simply. "You have the resources, the influence, and now the motivation. Show the world that the greatest success comes from lifting others up rather than climbing over them." As Richard watched, the figure of Jesus began to shimmer slightly, as though he were made of light that was slowly fading. "Are you leaving?" Richard asked with sudden panic. "I'm not leaving, Richard. I'm just returning to where I've always been, in your heart, waiting for you to live according to love instead of fear." The light grew brighter, and then Jesus was gone, leaving only the faintest scent of something Richard couldn't identify, something like bread and wine, and infinite compassion.
Richard sat alone in his office for several minutes, wondering if he had imagined the entire encounter. But the warmth in his chest, the peace in his mind, and the complete absence of the guilt that had tormented him for 23 years, told him that something miraculous had just occurred. He picked up his phone and dialed Margaret's extension. "Margaret, I want you to contact David Martinez's widow, find out where she lives, what she needs, how we can help. And I want to schedule a meeting with every employee who has a family member in college, or planning to attend college. Sir, that could be hundreds of people. Then schedule hundreds of meetings. And Margaret, yes sir, cancel all my social obligations for the next month. I'm going to be spending my evenings visiting employees in their homes, learning their stories, and figuring out how to be the kind of leader this company deserves." As Richard began planning his transformation from ruthless CEO to compassionate leader, he felt something he hadn't experienced since he was a young man full of dreams. Genuine excitement about the future. The man he had fired yesterday hadn't just been an employee, he had been a savior, appearing exactly when Richard needed him most, offering exactly the challenge that could crack through decades of hardened cynicism. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to choose love over fear, compassion over efficiency, humanity over profit. And for the first time in 23 years, Richard Blackstone was eager to see what kind of company and what kind of man he could become.
6 months after the encounter that changed his life forever, Richard Blackstone stood before the largest gathering of business leaders in New York City. The annual Corporate Leadership Summit had invited him to speak about his company's unprecedented transformation, though none of them truly understood what had triggered the changes. The Blackstone Tower had become something entirely different from the cold monument to capitalism it had once been. The executive floors now housed a child care center where employees could bring their children during school holidays. The cafeteria served free meals to any employees struggling financially. Conference rooms had been converted into quiet spaces where people could pray, meditate, or simply find peace during stressful days. Most remarkably, the company's profits had increased by 38% since implementing what Richard called compassionate capitalism. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard began looking out at an audience of skeptical CEOs who had come to see if he had truly lost his mind or discovered something revolutionary. 6 months ago, I was exactly like most of you. I measured success exclusively in quarterly earnings. I treated employees as expendable resources. I believed that kindness was a luxury that profitable companies couldn't afford. He paused, thinking about Sandra Williams, who was now working flexible hours while caring for her mother in hospice care. Her productivity had actually increased since she stopped worrying about losing her job. I was wrong about everything. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Richard Blackstone admitting error was like watching the Pope declare himself atheist. "Let me tell you about Fernando Martinez," Richard continued. 8 years ago we hired him as a security guard. For 8 years he worked nights, picked up weekend shifts, and never complained. Meanwhile, his brilliant daughter was watching her dreams of college disappear because our company policy was that employee problems weren't company concerns. Richard clicked to the next slide, showing a photograph of Maria Martinez in her freshman year at MIT, wearing a t-shirt that read Blackstone Educational Scholar. Maria is now studying aerospace engineering, fully funded by our company. But here's what's interesting. Her father's loyalty and productivity have increased dramatically. He's become an informal mentor to younger security staff. He's implemented 3 cost-saving innovations that have saved us over $2 million. Investing in his daughter's education was the best business decision we've made this decade. The audience was listening more intently now. CEOs understood the language of return on investment. "Let me tell you about David Williams," Richard said, advancing to another slide showing a young man in a company uniform. "David started in our mailroom 6 months ago. Single father, high school dropout, struggling to support his 8-year-old son. Under our old policies, David would have remained in the mailroom forever." The next slide showed David in a classroom surrounded by books and computers. Today, David is completing his GED through our employee education program while working full-time. Next year he'll start college courses also funded by the company. His son has gone from failing grades to honor roll because David can finally help with homework instead of working 3 jobs just to survive. Richard could see the shift in the room. These weren't bleeding heart stories anymore. They were case studies in human capital development. Our employee turnover rate has dropped from 47% to 8%, Richard continued. Our productivity is up 32%. Customer satisfaction scores have reached all-time highs, and yes, our profits have increased substantially. He clicked to the financial charts that made the audience lean forward. But the most important change isn't measurable in dollars, Richard said, his voice growing softer. It's the change in the culture of our organization. People come to work excited about contributing to something meaningful rather than dreading another day of soul-crushing routine. A hand shot up in the audience. Mr. Blackstone, what exactly triggered this transformation? Did you hire new consultants? Attend some kind of leadership retreat? Richard smiled, thinking about the mysterious man who had appeared in his life for less than 24 hours but had changed everything. I encountered someone who helped me remember who I wanted to be when I first started this company, Richard said carefully. Someone who showed me that the choice between profit and compassion is a false choice. The most profitable companies in the long term are the ones that treat people with dignity. Another hand. But surely there have to be limits. You can't solve every employee's personal problem. You're right, Richard agreed. We can't solve every problem, but we can create an environment where people feel valued, supported, and respected. We can offer flexibility instead of rigidity. We can provide opportunities instead of just paychecks. He advanced to the next slide, showing the company's organizational chart, but instead of the traditional hierarchy, it looked more like a wheel with support services radiating out from a central hub. We've restructured our entire company around the principle that the purpose of business is to serve human flourishing, not the other way around. Every policy, every decision, every initiative is evaluated based on one question: does this help our people become the best versions of themselves? And if it's not profitable, came a voice from the back. In 3 years of asking that question, we haven't found a single instance where treating people well contradicted long-term profitability, Richard replied. The challenge is that most businesses optimize for quarterly results rather than sustainable success. After the presentation, Richard was surrounded by executives asking detailed questions about implementation, metrics, and scalability. But one woman waited until the crowd dispersed before approaching him. Mr. Blackstone, she said, I'm Elizabeth Chen, CEO of Pacific Innovation. I have to ask, was there really just one person who inspired all these changes? Because what you've described sounds like a complete philosophical transformation. Richard looked at Elizabeth carefully. Something in her eyes suggested she was asking a deeper question than the others. Why do you ask? Because 6 months ago something similar happened to me. A man appeared at our company. No credentials, no explanation for how he got hired. He worked one day in our customer service department, and in that single day he somehow resolved conflicts that had been ongoing for months. He helped employees with personal problems that our HR department said were outside company scope. Richard felt his pulse quicken. What did this man look like? Mid-30s, shoulder-length dark hair, beard, simple clothes but immaculate appearance. The most remarkable eyes I've ever seen, like they could see straight through to your soul. What happened to him? Elizabeth's voice grew quiet. I fired him. I told him he didn't fit our corporate culture, but that night I couldn't stop thinking about the things he'd said, the way he'd helped people, the peace that seemed to follow him wherever he went. And then I started changing things. Policies, procedures, priorities. My board thought I'd lost my mind, but the results speak for themselves. We've had our most profitable 6 months in company history. Richard and Elizabeth looked at each other with the recognition of people who had shared an impossible experience. Did he ever tell you his name? Richard asked. He said it wasn't important what he was called, only what he did. But when I pressed him, he said some people knew him as Jesus. The conference hall had mostly emptied, but Richard barely noticed. He visited both our companies, and probably others, Elizabeth said. I've been hearing rumors about similar transformations at companies across the country. CEOs suddenly discovering compassion, corporations implementing radical employee-friendly policies, businesses thriving by putting people before profits. Richard thought about the implications. How many companies do you think he's visited? I don't know. But I think we might want to find out. Over the following weeks, Richard and Elizabeth began reaching out to other business leaders, carefully probing for stories similar to their own. What they discovered was extraordinary. In Seattle, a tech company CEO named Michael Chen described a mysterious programmer who had worked for exactly 1 week, revolutionizing their approach to work-life balance and inspiring a complete cultural transformation.
In Atlanta, a manufacturing executive named Sarah Rodriguez told them about a factory worker who had somehow known the personal struggles of every employee and had helped management implement support systems that dramatically improved productivity and morale. In Chicago, a retail chain owner described a store clerk who had worked 3 days, turning their worst-performing location into their most successful by teaching management how to truly serve both customers and employees. Every story followed the same pattern: a mysterious figure appearing with minimal credentials, working briefly but making profound impact, then disappearing after planting seeds of transformation that grew into company-wide changes.
"It's him," Richard said during one of his weekly phone calls with Elizabeth. "It has to be. He's visiting companies across the country, changing one organization at a time." "But why?" Elizabeth asked. "What's the end game?" Richard thought about his own transformation, about the employees whose lives had been changed, about the ripple effects that continued to spread through his industry. "Maybe he's trying to transform capitalism itself," Richard said. "Not by destroying it, but by reminding us what it was supposed to be. A system that serves human dignity, rather than destroying it." The evidence continued to mount. Business magazines began reporting on a trend they called the compassionate CEO movement. Harvard Business School launched a study of companies that had implemented radical employee-friendly policies and were somehow achieving unprecedented success. Richard found himself at the center of this movement, frequently invited to speak about sustainable business practices and human-centered management. But he never told the full truth about his encounter with Jesus, knowing that most audiences weren't ready for that level of revelation. Instead, he focused on the practical results: increased productivity, decreased turnover, improved customer satisfaction, and yes, higher profits. He presented compassionate capitalism as a business strategy rather than a spiritual awakening. But late at night, alone in his office, Richard would sometimes sense a familiar presence. Not the dramatic appearance that had changed his life, but a quiet awareness that he wasn't implementing these changes alone. One evening, exactly 1 year after their first encounter, Richard was working late when he heard a soft knock on his office door. He looked up to see Jesus standing there, no longer in custodial clothes but wearing the same simple robes from their second meeting. "Hello, Richard," Jesus said, entering the office with that same peaceful presence. "You came back," Richard said, standing and moving around his desk. "I never left, but I wanted to see how you were doing." Richard gestured around his transformed office. Gone were most of the awards and symbols of dominance. In their place were photographs of employees and their families, letters of gratitude from people whose lives had been changed by company policies, and children's drawings from the daycare center. "I think I'm finally becoming the man I was supposed to be," Richard said. "You've done well," Jesus replied. "But this is just the beginning." "The beginning of what?" Jesus moved to the window, looking out at the city lights. "The beginning of a transformation that will spread far beyond your company, beyond your industry, beyond what you can imagine. Other companies, other CEOs like Elizabeth and me. Every person who chooses love over fear creates ripples that touch countless lives. Every business that prioritizes human dignity changes the culture of capitalism. Every leader who discovers that true success comes from lifting others up inspires others to do the same." Richard joined Jesus at the window. "Will you keep visiting companies, keep changing hearts and minds?" Jesus smiled. "I visit every heart that's ready to hear truth. Sometimes that's in a boardroom, sometimes in a factory, sometimes in a family kitchen. The location doesn't matter. What matters is the willingness to choose love." "What do you want me to do now?" "Keep doing what you're doing. Keep showing the world that businesses can be profitable and compassionate. Keep proving that the greatest success comes from serving others rather than serving yourself." Jesus turned from the window and placed his scarred hand on Richard's shoulder. "And remember that every employee you treat with dignity, every family you help, every life you improve is a prayer made manifest. You're not just running a company, Richard, you're participating in the healing of the world." As Richard watched, Jesus began to fade again, becoming translucent like morning mist. "Will I see you again?" Richard asked. "You'll see me every time you look at your employees with compassion instead of suspicion. You'll hear me every time you choose generosity over greed. You'll feel me every time you remember that love is the foundation of everything worthwhile." Jesus disappeared, leaving behind only the scent of bread and wine, and the absolute certainty that Richard was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. 5 years later,
Richard Blackstone stood before the United Nations Economic Council, delivering a keynote address about sustainable business practices to representatives from every developed nation. The Blackstone Company had become a case study taught in business schools worldwide. Their employee satisfaction scores were unprecedented. Their innovation rates had tripled. Their profit margins consistently exceeded industry standards. But more importantly, they had inspired a movement. Hundreds of companies had adopted similar policies. The concept of stakeholder capitalism, considering employees, communities, and environment alongside shareholders, had moved from fringe theory to mainstream practice. The transformation of business culture isn't just possible, Richard told the assembled delegates, it's inevitable. Companies that treat people as assets to be optimized rather than humans to be valued will find themselves increasingly unable to compete with organizations that understand the truth. Our greatest competitive advantage isn't our technology, our capital, or our market position, it's our people. He clicked to his final slide, showing a photograph of the Blackstone Company's current workforce, 4,200 employees, 89% retention rate, 94% satisfaction scores. But these numbers don't tell the real story, Richard said. The real story is Maria Martinez, who graduated summa cum laude from MIT, and is now designing spacecraft that will take humanity to Mars. The real story is David Williams, who earned his MBA while working full-time and now runs our community outreach division. The real story is Sandra Williams, who was able to spend her mother's final months providing love and comfort instead of choosing between family and financial survival. He paused, looking out at the faces of people who had the power to influence business practices across the globe. 6 years ago I was a different man running a different kind of company. I measured success in dollars and treated people as interchangeable parts in a profit-generating machine. I was successful by traditional metrics, but I was failing as a human being. What changed? Asked the delegate from Germany. Richard smiled, thinking about a mysterious custodian who had appeared in his life for less than 48 hours, but had transformed everything. I met someone who reminded me that the purpose of business isn't to generate profit. Profit is simply the result of serving people well. I learned that the most sustainable success comes from creating value for everyone: employees, customers, communities, and yes, shareholders. And this person was a business consultant. No, Richard said quietly. He was someone who understood that love is the most practical force in the universe, someone who knew that organizations built on fear and greed will ultimately collapse, while those built on trust and compassion will endure. As Richard left the podium, he felt that familiar presence, that sense of approval and encouragement that had sustained him through 6 years of transformation. He might never see Jesus again in physical form, but the principles he had taught continued to guide every decision, every policy, every interaction. The businessman who had once fired Jesus from his company had become living proof that redemption was possible, that hearts could change, that love could indeed transform the world, one person, one company, one decision at a time. In his hotel room that night, Richard opened his laptop and began writing in the journal he had kept since his encounter with Jesus. His final entry read, "Today I spoke to world leaders about business transformation, but I didn't tell them the whole truth. I didn't tell them that real change begins not with new policies or procedures, but with new hearts. I didn't tell them that the man who changed my life was the same man who changed the world 2,000 years ago, and who continues to change lives today for anyone willing to listen. What I can tell them is this: when we choose love over fear, compassion over competition, service over self-interest, miracles happen, not the kind of miracles that defy natural law, but the kind that reveal what was always possible when human beings remember their highest purpose." The wealthy businessman who fired Jesus learned that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in lives transformed. True power isn't the ability to control others, but the ability to serve them. True success isn't climbing over others to reach the top, but lifting others up so that everyone can rise together. And the most profound truth of all, it's never too late to become the person you were meant to be. Richard closed the laptop and walked to his window, looking out at the lights of New York City far below. Somewhere in those millions of lights were other business leaders facing the same choices he had faced 6 years ago. Some would choose fear, some would choose love, some would build walls, others would build bridges. But Richard knew with absolute certainty that the man who had changed his life was still working, still visiting, still offering the same choice to anyone ready to receive it. will you choose love? And in boardrooms across the world, one heart at a time, the answer was increasingly becoming yes. The end. What an incredible journey we've just witnessed. Richard Blackstone's transformation from a ruthless CEO to a compassionate leader reminds us that it's never too late to change the course of our lives. When Jesus walked into that corporate tower, he didn't come with judgment or condemnation. He came with love and the gentle challenge to remember who we were meant to be. The most powerful moment for me was when Richard finally recognized those nail-scarred hands. In that instant, 23 years of guilt and hardened hearts melted away. It wasn't magic, it was grace. The same grace that's available to each of us, regardless of our past mistakes or current circumstances. Think about the ripple effect of one encounter. Richard's transformation didn't just change his life, it changed Sandra's family, Fernando's daughter Maria, David Williams and his son, and eventually thousands of employees and their families. When we choose love over fear, compassion over profit, the impact spreads far beyond what we can imagine. But here's what really strikes me. Jesus didn't force the change. He simply presented Richard with truth and let him choose. That's how transformation always works. It begins with a choice to see ourselves and others differently. This story challenges every one of us. Are we leading with love or fear? Are we treating people as resources to be used or as souls to be valued? Are we building walls or bridges in our daily interactions? The beautiful truth is that Jesus is still walking into our offices today, whether that's our workplace, our home or our heart. He's still offering the same gentle challenge. Will you choose love? What struck you most about Richard's transformation? Have you ever had an encounter that completely changed your perspective on success and relationships? And here's the question I'd love to hear your thoughts on. If Jesus walked into your workplace or life today, what would he find? What changes would he gently encourage you to make? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.